Hi and welcome to AXSchat. I'm really delighted to welcome Vint Cert, who is one of the fathers of the internet, with us today. He's Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and also, along with David Bray, who we've had before on AXSchat, responsible for the people-centered internet. Now, this is a topic that is absolutely close to the heart of all three of us within AXSchat, because we believe that a people-centered internet is an inclusive internet, and that means it's inclusive of persons with disabilities. So accessibility has to be core to some of the aims of that. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us, Vint. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background that led you to start the People-Centered Internet Initiative?
Well, I want to give credit to Mei-Lin Feng, who was really the spark plug behind People-Centered Internet. She's a Singaporean by birth. She lives in the Bay Area, was very active in developing customer relationship management concepts at Oracle. But her real passion has always been to find ways of making the internet more useful for everybody. And that means not just access to it and affordability, but content. It means useful content. It means content that's in local languages that make it accessible in one sense of the word. So people-centrism, I think, is a very important aspect of internet thinking that gets us beyond the physical infrastructure and gets us to the point where we see how this can be made useful. And her interest was to find metrics to show that access to the internet actually made a difference, that it improved quality of life, that it improved GDP, that it improved other metrics, health, for example, because of access to information. So I thought that was a very important perspective to put on the table and to pursue. And so I agreed to serve as chairman of the board of PCI. And David, as you may know, has accepted the position of executive director of the organization. And I would venture to say that we're both driven by Mei-Lin's determination that this be a successful enterprise.
Yeah, we've met Mei-Lin, and I'm also a big fan, and I know Debra and Antonio are too. David, big fans of you too. Please tell us a bit more about your new role, because last time we interviewed you, you were the Chief Information Officer at the FCC, so it's quite a change.
It is, although it's still sort of focusing on how do you champion the activities of positive change agents. And as Vint said, it really is recognizing that the internet needs to be accessible to all. As you said, Neil, accessibility at its core. And so we have several sort of things that we need to help make happen. And PCI, I equate it as sort of being like a nimble startup meets a nonprofit, meets a for-benefit corporation, all rolled into one. Part of that is just the sheer energy of both Mei-Lin and Vint and the different volunteers we have doing it. It is mainly a volunteer organization. And what we're trying to do is help connect efforts that are trying to demonstrate a more people-centered internet approach to the different expertise, supports, and the resources to help make it happen. Again, we can't do it all by ourselves. However, I think the beauty of is through Vint's network, through Mei-Lin's network, we have other board members as well, through people like you with Accessibility Chat, we can begin to build these networks and sort of embody what Doug Engelbart's vision was, what the technology can actually help connect and empower people to have better lives going forward. And so we don't pretend to be able to do everything by ourselves, but as Vint mentioned, it's really core about trying to identify those efforts that are tangibly and measurably improving people's lives, one of which is accessibility, both in terms of to communities that have different needs in how they access the information, but also overcoming language barriers, overcoming community barriers, and really thinking about at the end of the day, how can we use technology to bring together communities as opposed to pulling us apart?
So we actually have capabilities, not at PCI specifically, but more generally, technological capabilities that can aid in this initiative. For example, Google has a translation capability, which I think is drawing communities together that otherwise couldn't communicate with each other for lack of translation. We're still some distance away from being able to do sign to text, for example, which is something that Ken Herrenstein, another one of our Google team, would really love to see happen. On the other hand, we can do a lot about taking voice to text, and that helps. And so captioning, for example, of videos. or text in lieu of or in addition to spoken information in an interactive setting can help a lot. I'll give you an example of a philosophy that I hope we can adopt at PCI. You know that this Internet of Things is fast upon us. You know, lots and lots of devices with software on board. And people have been focusing on voice interaction with these things. So you have Alexa, you have Google Home and Assistant, you have Siri, and so on. There's an awful lot of voice interaction. The trouble is that often it's voice back. That doesn't help if you happen to be deaf. So figuring out how to get the system to interact on all possible platforms through all possible media, and to be flexible about that is really important. So if I speak a command, but I need to see an answer back, I need some place to show that answer. So a voice-enabled device needs to also have an avenue for communicating in a visual way. But on top of that, I'd like to be able to send a short message, for example, to my refrigerator, or I want to be able to send an email to Google Assistant to get it to do something for me. We need to be thinking about how the Internet of Things can be more useful for everyone by allowing communication on all possible platforms and all possible modalities. And getting people to think about that broadly, instead of thinking, okay, you have an app and you have a device, end of story, is part of the thing that I hope PCI can convey.
Uh-oh. Neil, speaking of which, we see you talking, but we can't hear you. Uh-oh.
We can go ahead and let him correct that and see. Nope, still can't hear you.
Try another one.
There you go. Now we can hear you.
What is it that you're doing that causes this to happen? Do we know?
Putting it on mute so that you don't enjoy the benefit of my dog whining for a walk.
I see. Okay.
And taking it back off mute seems to be the problem. So I swap microphones every time. So I'm very interested because I'm a speech recognition user and I have been for 20 years almost. And the issues you mentioned about speech feedback also affect me as someone with dyslexia who has a very poor working memory.
I see.
Because actually it's great to issue a command to something by voice, but when you get back a plethora of choices, I'd have forgotten what they are. So I have similar issues, although they manifest in a slightly different way. So we need to be thinking about the ways that we convey information.
That's fascinating. I hadn't even thought about this, but it drives me crazy when you get to a telephone tree.
Yes.
Automatic response system saying, please listen carefully. Our options have changed, and they go through 10 different things. Yes. And then you can't remember which one it is that you want.
Yeah.
That's when you push 0 and ask for a person.
Right. Representative.
Keep stabbing 0. So one of the things that as the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force were asking for was consistency of the number that you press to get through to a person. Because actually that changes depending on various IVRs. But essentially with the Internet of Things, what I think is key to all of this is thinking about interoperability, because people are going to want to use things in different ways. People have different needs, different languages, different abilities, different impairments, and the information's there. It's how we serve it up, and it's how we get stuff to talk to each other. Because you talked about people thinking about serving people by apps. Well, everyone's going to have different apps. So it's making sure that they can all work together. And I think that is a key part of the success, the future success of an inclusive internet. And I'm going to shut up and hand over to David, because I know David was about to say something before I failed.
Oh, actually, you said it, and I just want to amplify what you said, which is interoperability is key, regardless of either human needs or machine needs. As your microphone example demonstrated in some respects, it may be that the modality in which something is even being communicated is not voice. It may be that it is going to be, as Vint mentioned, through sign language or through some other means. Or it may even be a machine talking that later wants to involve a human. The challenge we have is when the web pages were static, when we were doing the days of HTML 3.2, and I'm not saying we go back to that, it was easier to bake in accessibility in terms of being able to do screen readers and things such as that. The challenge now with apps, however, they're being so rapidly prototyped that it's not high on the priority list for developers to think about how to make their app accessible to other interoperable means. And so the question is, what can we do as people focusing and embodying a people-centered approach to the internet? What can we do to encourage apps to be more people-centric, but also make the case to developers that if you make it more people-centric, not only will your app be used by more people, but then also the reality that it'll also be used by more machines. And in a previous conversation that actually Debra and I had with Teresa Shea at the NIH, the statistics is 1 in 4 of us will develop a need in our lifetime. We may not be born with it, but we will develop a need to actually have that accessibility. So can we actually make this a rallying cry for all of us in the world?
So there are some issues here that David's comments highlight, and I'd like to spend a minute on them if it's okay to dive a little bit deep into technical matters.
Of course. Dive deep.
So let's start with interoperability. In order to achieve it, we have to have standards, and so this is a way of assuring that things will interwork is that they adopt the same standards. The reason that turns out to be important is that while you could achieve interoperability by having bilateral negotiation, what you want is to avoid 10 million bilateral negotiations to assure interworking. So that's one point. Standards are important. Second thing is that it's very likely that not all possible modalities of use of some of these services can either be understood, contemplated, planned for, and implemented by every producer of these devices and services. So what do we do about that? Well, let's go back now to the standards thing and say, listen, I might be in need of very special kinds of accommodation. If my mobile or other portable device is configured to serve my needs, whether it's an increased enhanced audio or a speech to text display or maybe some other kind of special accommodation. If that device could have standard interactions with the service that we're after, with the IoT device that we're trying to interact with, I can bring some of my accessibility requirement solution to the problem. And so between the developers doing the best they can to offer these accommodations, and to the degree that they can't offer a standard interface that lets another party bring some of that accommodation along with them, we may get closer and closer to a fully accessible world of online interactive devices. So I guess one thing we need to encourage the standards organizations to do is to actually think their way through some of these issues. And for sure, we need feedback from the users who have these requirements to understand how best to accommodate them.
And real quick, I'll just amplify what Vint said real quick, is you're talking about an abstraction layer that actually helps the developers not have to write for all possible permeations, but then also lets the users have a common tool suite that they're accustomed to using. I would also say, again, as we go to a world with the IoT, this one gives you a locus of control about what modality you want to use to interface with, but also as more and more machine learning approaches are brought online, this will also help with training those assistants that we choose to involve in our lives.
So now there's a hazard here. And so I want to highlight this hazard because I'm not quite sure what to do about it myself. But this is sort of like, alcoholism, and so if you don't admit you have a problem, you'll never solve it. So here's the hazard. We continually work hard to allow human beings to interact with software. Now, let's imagine what the world is like from the software's point of view. It does not get interaction. It does not get input in the same way human beings get it. These machines don't have ears. They don't have eyes. They don't have fingers. So everything gets translated for them into a set of protocol-like interactions. The problem with that view of the world is that it's possible for other machines to emulate that interface and pretend to be a person. Now, does everyone here know what a botnet is? Do people know that there are bots that pretend to be people? For example, they pretend to be Facebook subscribers. They pretend to be Twitter customers. They pretend to be other things. And as far as the systems are concerned, they can't tell the difference. And so sometimes you've seen web pages that with interactive mechanisms that say, I am not a robot, and you're supposed to click something. Well, if the software is smart enough, it will read, I am not a robot, click here, and it will click here, and you will think it's not a robot. So we actually have a problem because this ability to pretend to be human is suddenly creating hazards in our social media. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that, short of requiring you to prick a finger and show that you can bleed, which is probably not going to be the most popular interface in the world, unless you're a diabetic and you needed to do that anyway to adjust your blood sugar level. So, this effort that we're putting into making computer interaction standardized and to assist in accommodation may actually also facilitate this not so good aspect of human-machine interaction. And I guess we're just going to have to struggle with how to accommodate that, how to deal with it. Otherwise, we will see a number of abuses showing up by replicating human behavior well enough to fool a lot of people.
And on that note, Vint, another problem that I see, which I also don't know how to resolve it, is that as we live our lives and a lot of us acquire disabilities, we're not staying up on top like the robots are doing on how we do things. So, for example, my husband now wears hearing aids for severe hearing loss, and the interoperability problems that he was having with his hearing aids and now using these different devices. And even though I'm in the business, still, this stuff is very complicated. And I often hear people saying, well, you know, my spouse was in a car accident, or they had a stroke, or, you know, they now have severe diabetes. So it's interesting that the technology, the computers are, you know, learning more than sometimes as individuals as our lives change. And now I am this person. That doesn't mean I'm broken. I just have a different way of accessing the internet. But a lot of people don't know how to assist me, how to drive. So you also have the complications of being a human being.
Actually, this is absolutely right. Now, here's another example of the struggle that we have, and that's people recognizing that someone else may be coming to them by, let's say, unusual means. So for people who are profoundly deaf, for example, there's the relay service. What's that? Well, you can talk to the relay person, and the relay person will, or you can type to the relay person. The relay person will speak to somebody else on your behalf, and it goes back and forth. When those relay calls show up, the receiving party, the hearing party, may not understand that there is an intermediary and that the voice that he or she is hearing is not the voice of the caller, but the voice of the relay operator. And my wife finally threw out all the, you know, teletypes and everything else because she found that particular means of interacting very slow and confusing for the people on the other end. The point I want to make is that we need to educate the general public about all these various accommodation methods so that they will be aware of various kinds of accommodation that might be in place and understand how to interact with it, as opposed to hanging up because they can't figure out what's going on.
Well, and real quick, just to build on what you were saying, Vint, I mean, I think as we go forward with the internet, you're absolutely right that we need to be concerned about themselves as actually doing that function. But at the same time, I think a lot of people would like a digital assistant that could help them. And so maybe there needs to be something that says you need to be able to flag yourself as saying, I'm serving as a digital assistant for either instruction purposes or translation purposes. And maybe, like you said, even with the relay example, I'm a human serving in that function. But then we get into the interesting world. I mean, I'm sure some of us have seen Blade Runner, which is, are we start treating bots as second-class citizens? I mean, again, they're just machines.
Yeah.
But this is going to create some fundamental challenges, because we even know from experiments back in the 1980s, 1990s, that people treat what a computer does as if it was human, even if it wasn't. Like when you program a machine in advance to play the game a certain way, and it plays the game a certain way, and people are upset at it, they hit the machine, they hit the box, and it's like, wait, it was just doing what it was programmed to do. And so the problem is ourselves. I mean, we anthropomorphize the machines. And so this is going to be an era of cognitive dissonance for the next few decades, I think.
So here's a little test for all of us on this call. If you use Google Maps or any of the other navigation tools that are available, Waze and so on, I don't know about you, but I confess to you that I talk back. And not necessarily expecting any responses, but it'll say turn right at the next corner, and I'll say no, I'm not going to do that because that's a dumb path. I'm going the other way. And for a while, you may recall that some of the machines, when you didn't do what you told them to do, would pause and then say recalculating. and if you went through several cycles of that, you got the impression that the machine was saying recalculating. And it left out the "you dumbass, don't you know how to follow directions?" I noticed that the Google Maps finally stopped doing that, and it just calmly lets you miss the turn, and then it says, "Okay, so go do this to get to the destination." And so we figured out that we shouldn't even suggest to the user of these services that they're failing to follow directions. You just say, okay, they didn't do that, so I'll accommodate and I'll give them the next best direction I can. I think, though, that David's point is extremely important, and Sherry Turkle at MIT has documented a lot of this behavior. She says that humaniform robots, the robots that have human-like characteristics, faces, mouths, eyes, are often assumed to have social intelligence beyond any conceivable reality. And so when the robots appear to be ignoring you, people get upset. Of course, as David says, it's just doing what it was programmed to do, but you're all angry because the machine has rejected you. And we have to help educate people about the limitations of some of these kinds of systems.
Oh, that's a great point. Siri always forgets who my mother is. So I don't know why. I mean, for some reason, she's fallen out of love with me. We had a wonderful relationship when I had an iPhone 4S, and over the years, she's got the 7-year itch, and effectively she's a bit stroppy these days, and she won't even tell me who my mother is. So I can't ring my mum anymore.
It's a classic mother-in-law syndrome. You need to probably go to counseling with your bot. So.
but I know Antonio has a question. So
just as to go along with this, I'm not able to ask Alexa to play songs from Portuguese authors, or Spanish. But I think that will happen to most people who want to play songs from that group that are not in the English language. So if any of you try to use Alexa to play or to ask music from a Portuguese or Spanish author that you might like, you might not be able to play it from Spotify. So the machines you are able to choose things in the English language, but then if it gets outside that, it doesn't work, and that creates a sort of this doesn't seem to be important, but in the end, when they analyze the number of plays from a certain music, Spanish or Portuguese music might be in a situation that they don't have that many people playing them, not because people don't want to play them, but machines act as a front or don't operate in the way that allow people to make those choices.
Yeah, this is such an important point, and it gets back to both the utility of the internet and localization, the ability to interact in comfortable ways in languages that are most familiar and comfortable to you. There is a very, very interesting technical problem here, which I encountered a couple of years ago with one of our natural language processing team. We had done fairly well in single language interactions, whether it was French or Spanish or English or Japanese and so on. But we discovered that multilingual communities, this is typically not the US, but frankly, in Europe, there are people who speak multiple languages. And in India, for example, there are 22 different official languages. Everybody speaks at least one, two, or at least two or three. So here's the problem. They fall into a kind of mixed vocabulary drawn from multiple languages. And the natural language processing systems get very confused because they're not getting all Spanish or all French or all English. And I frankly haven't figured out how to deal with that problem. But it's quite natural for people in multilingual communities to have a single sentence which throws in terms from several languages all within that one sentence.
Well, and to build on Vint's point and actually raise an interesting humorous point that Antonio just did. So when he was mentioning a device that I will not name because I do not want to activate it during this cast, I'm here in Singularity University and we have tons of these devices behind us. His voice actually activated the device behind me. So we are going to definitely get into this interesting world in which we're going to have unintended consequences, unintended behavior, some of which will be funny, some of which will be humorous, but we are going to be in a very interesting world that I think is unprecedented for the human species. And I think this gets to the importance of accessibility chat, people-centered internet. We just need to help navigate this together and actually share ideas about how we move forward as positive change agents.
So specific to David's point about voice interaction, while it is touted right now as the latest thing, noise pollution is going to be a serious problem in two respects. The first one is everybody talking to their devices, which literally creates noise, and that will also impair the ability of the device to interact properly because it'll be getting sound from all directions. So we have this need to have alternatives to the voiced interaction in order to keep. Imagine you're sitting in a classroom and people are taking notes by speaking, to their mobiles. It can't carry on a reasonable conversation in that case. So I think we need to be very cautious about people, blasting off in some shiny new direction, so to speak, to mix a metaphor, without thinking about the consequences of that at scale.
I agree. And as a person that has ADHD, Vint, when there are multiple conversations going on like that, I start getting anxiety and getting a little stressed. So, I mean, I've learned to deal with it. But I think another thing that we are learning as societies to understand, which is why I think the people-centered internet is so important. And I think the work you did, Vince, with I4J is so important, but is making sure we have diverse teams, because there is an example that somebody told me on another show that I do about Mattel giving one of the Barbie dolls artificial intelligence. And so they were talking about workforce and looking at it from the audience of most of the, a lot of the people that buy Barbie dolls are young girls. And so they were talking about employment for women. For girls, thus women in the future. And so the team was a small team of white males. And so a little girl was asking Barbie what she should be doing. What jobs she could do. And she said, well, I want to be a scientist. I want to be a nuclear engineer. And Barbie came back and said, well, have you thought about being in the fashion industry? So that wound up being a big embarrassment for Mattel. And of course, Mattel fixed it quickly. But I think all of these things that we're talking about here continue to show us why we need diverse, inclusive teams. We need people that come from different backgrounds, have different abilities, have walked different paths in their lives, because it really, will reduce some of the biases that we have. So just dovetailing on what you were saying, Vint.
No, I just let me follow up a little bit from what you're saying, Debra. I've been, over the last couple of years, I've been in quite a good number of hackathon startup weekends, and people trying to create new things, new apps, new systems, and you end up that most of these events, they have a very homogeneous group of people developing things. And sometimes they are also created in a way that somehow are more appealing to you than to other people who are not in the certain age group. So the challenge for us, how we can change that, and following your lead with that question, make sure that the teams that are behind the systems are diverse, or at least they are able to engage with groups where they can learn from about their needs.
Yeah, I think that's important. The other thing that I think was really important, and still touching on the point of bias, and this comes back to a conversation that was happening on Twitter that you were engaged in, David, over the last couple of days, is actually looking at the bias in algorithms. Because as we get these more and more intelligent services which are powered by algorithms, we need to be mindful of the fact that the algorithms, to a large extent, are created by humans that innately have bias. And even the ones that are created by machines have been created by algorithms that have been created by humans that have innate bias. So we need to find ways that of being mindful of this and finding frameworks for balancing and reducing that bias. We can't completely eliminate it, because even our concept of bias is biased. But at the same time, when we're using these technologies to determine whether or not people get products, services, access to finance and housing and all of the rest of it, it's a really deeply important thing that we're mindful of this as at the point of design.
So let's talk a little bit about the origins of bias in algorithms. Many of these algorithms are based on machine learning methods, which work by exposing a neural network to a series of inputs and then training the algorithm to respond to those inputs in the ways that are intended. What can happen is that the machine will adopt whatever bias the samples were that were inherent in those samples. And sometimes it's very unconscious that your samples were biased, as you point out. And you won't know that, of course, until you see the results of the algorithm actually running in the real world. And even then, sometimes it may be a very subtle kind of bias, which raises a very interesting question about trying to detect the presence of bias in some of these algorithms and then try to do something about it. But the training samples turn out to be a very critical element here. It's not like somebody's going in and carefully handcrafting each one of the weights in the neural network. It's this more gross interactive process.
And to amplify Vint's point, I'm smiling because I was thinking the same thoughts he is, that in some respects, the algorithm is only as good as the data it's fed. And if the data is not representative of the community and is not diverse in of itself, well, the computer adage is garbage in, garbage out. Now, at the same time, I celebrate that in some respects we're asking these questions because we can now do this because of the computational power of these machines. And I think when we think about people-centered internet, it's not saying that we're not against some automation in your life, we're not against some bots, but it's thinking about, let's think about when we empower these machines, when we actually feed them data, we do so in a way that moves it forward. The other thing that I would also say is, and this may be an early preview, and I wish, unfortunately, Mei-Lin was not able to join us, but Mei-Lin, Vint, and I have been talking about, one, thinking about, is there a way that we could start having sort of things that, signs that show that companies are adhering to people-centric principles? In other words, the way they engage on the internet, they engage with people, they're people-centered in nature. And with that, one of the things we've also talked about is, do companies need to actually have almost like a data governance board that takes responsibility for looking at the data that's being fed to the machine? Is it diverse? And then actually then following up and saying, look, it may not be perfect when it first comes out, but is the machine reaching spurious correlations or prejudice correlations that we don't want? And then how do we adjust that? Because I think that's a new role that just hasn't existed before because we just didn't have this series of automation that we do now.
That's true. And there's a really interesting example of the garbage in effect was with the US justice system, where effectively they were looking and determining whether or not someone would qualify for parole, I think it was. And of course, they were looking and feeding in the previous convictions and everything else. But there's innate bias in the justice system. So what they were doing was feeding in biased data. So what that then resulted in was people of ethnic origin not getting parole. Because the computer system said there was more of a risk. So
what you really want is actually to show it back and do the reverse, which says, looking at the last 20 years, are you aware that you've made these decisions? Or even, I mean, for example, chief financial officers, there really should be no correlation to the amount you earn as a chief financial officer and your height. I don't think your height makes you better as a chief financial officer than other ways. But we know, unfortunately, and this is not just for chief financial officers, that height leads to better pay. And is that fair? Same thing with gender. I'm sure Debra has some thoughts there as well. So I'll hand it over to her.
Well, no. You know, it's funny. I thought as a woman that a lot of these issues that are now coming up, I thought naively that a lot more had been done. And so it's just very interesting watching all this happen in our lifetimes. And yes, we have a lot of problems that we're trying to solve and figure out. And I think it's always interesting. I've been a technologist my whole life, and my dad was before me, but I always think it's interesting when people are like, no, put that artificial intelligence back in the box. Nope, that's not the answer. So how do we evolve as species, as society? How do we make sure that it enhances our technology? So I love this conversation.
No, I'd like to know what's your thoughts on. We are debating all these challenges today, but there's plenty of people coming studying about web development. How can we change the curriculums in order for them to adapt to the reality that we'll have to face?
So that's a really interesting question. Let me give you an example of an unintended consequence, and that will, I think, illustrate how hard it is to plot a path forward as we rely increasingly on this online environment. When the internet was being built, most of us who worked on it were in the research or academic sector. And our means of interacting with each other was to share information, to exchange information. So you didn't buy somebody else's information, you shared your own. And it was a kind of a barter, information barter system. And so part of our motivation was to reduce the barriers to access to information and to the sharing of information. So that was an important goal. And it is, I would say, consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that freedom of expression and freedom of access to information is part of that framework. So I'm sitting here feeling very proud of the fact that we'd suppressed the barriers to information generation and sharing and access. Until I started seeing some of the side effects of that reduced barrier, which is the promulgation of misinformation, disinformation, fraud, abuse, harassment, all kinds of other abusive practices in this essentially wide open platform. And so now we discover that lowering the barriers has also allowed stuff in which is harmful to our society, with malware, for example, denial of service attacks. So the question is, how do you cope with that? And it's not exactly clear what the right thing to do is, and this is not intended to be a long, gigantic harangue on the subject. But we now are faced with the consequences of having done what we thought was a very important step in enabling the kinds of Engelbartian interaction among the members of our society.
And to build on Vince, I mean, he said it so beautifully. The internet in some respects is a reflection of humanity. And humans are great. We do wonderful things. We do also a lot of mediocre things. We watch cat videos and things like that. The internet's also brought us that. And we also, unfortunately, do less than good things, too. It's unfortunate, but the same technologies you and I use on a daily basis were also used to plan the Mumbai terrorist attacks, to figure out how to do the attack, how to coordinate it, and then, unfortunately, who they actually assassinated. Now, that's not to mean that we should give up on all technology or we can design technology only for good. I think that would be erroneous. I mean, Fire can cook meals, it can warm your house, but it can also create pain and can burn things. Technology's always had this sort of double-edged sword. The question is, how do we have conversations as broadly as possible and think, you know, again, you're not going to be able to predict the future, but have some forethought when we go into it in terms of how do we account for the human use of these tools, especially because we are becoming super empowered through technologies like the internet, through machine learning, to do things that are just unprecedented as a species.
And I so agree. And I think that is why I'll admit I am a silver lining type girl, but, or woman, but that's why I'm very hopeful that about, you know, Vint Cert continuing to be in this conversation, David, you being in it, Maylin, the people-centered internet, the I4J stuff, all the different, I think there's a lot of very smart, educated, thoughtful people that are trying to make sure that as society we continue to evolve and that technology mainly can be used for good. I hear a lot. All of us obviously are very active on social media. We do AXSchat on Twitter, but the reality is I hear people say to me all the time, Debra, I don't know why you're on Twitter. It's terrible. There's such bad stuff out there and horrible. And I said, yeah, but you know, there's also some really good stuff. Have you checked out #ChangeAgents? You know, have you checked out what we're doing at AXSchat? Pink Socks. There's a lot of really smart people really trying to make sure that we evolve in the right way. We can't stop this.
Wait a minute. I need help here. Debra, how could anyone wearing pink socks be thought to be smart? I mean, pink socks?
Oh, well, we'll have to educate you on that.
Yeah, they want to make sure. The pink socks groups want to make sure that the health, all of the medical and the health and all that it is definitely being done thoughtfully, just like we're doing all this. And we're going to have to get you a pair of pink socks. It looks like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sartorial disaster.
Exactly, but the sartorial disaster is designed to be the catalyst to open conversation. It's like, why are you wearing those disgusting pink socks with black moustaches on? Let me tell you a story, and here's the gift. And so we it's created a movement in the healthcare space all around this, which is around gifting and around sharing. So and that movement's on the hashtag. And yes, we do wear horrendous socks.
Well, and what I love about that is it's got a physical manifestation. And I have to admit, so when I took on my role when I was serving in a previous public capacity that allowed me to, I did go to social media because I wanted to hear and learn from people. And when I initially joined, I think people were a little bit skeptical. And then there was also, as Vint mentioned, you sometimes get a little bit of harassment and things like that. I have to admit, now that I recently have become a new father, I am thinking about myself in terms of, one, what will eventually my son do with social media? But I'm also wondering if maybe now might be a time for me to be more focusing in person for right now and do more face-to-face and less social media. But it's a choice. And to have that sort of resistat, and so I celebrate that your movement with the pink socks, it actually has face-to-face, it actually has tangibility. We also, with the change agents, we try to get people together. So just so if in the future you see me disappear from social media, it's not because I don't think that social media has value. It may just be that to everything there's a season, and it's actually trying to figure out how do you want to engage the communities that you want to do to move things forward.
Well said, David.
I think that nothing quite beats face-to-face interaction. However, one of the most important things for us and our particular community about social media is that many people with disabilities can't get to physical meetups. There are these physical barriers, and what social media has enabled us to do is create these virtual communities of people that are able to suddenly have a much more powerful voice when we come together. So for us, it's been tremendously enabling. We also want the face-to-face. We greatly value, would love to meet you in person one of these days. I'm sure we'll make it happen. But there's a place for both, absolutely. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. It's been fantastic chatting with you today. Need to thank Barclays, who support us and help us get all of the captioning done, which is obviously very important. Thank you so much, Vint Cert and David Bray.
Can I real quick ask you
Thank you.
one thing real quick, Neil and Antonia and Debra, real quick?
Sure.
As an open invitation, it would be great if you could actually engage the accessibility community as to what would be the features of a more empowering, more positive social media platform. We would love to hear your ideas. And you
Good
can send
idea.
them, both Vint and I.
Well,
And sort of building what you said is that you're absolutely right. It allows people that might not be able to get out physically to engage. The question is, as Vint said, we don't either want to have paywalls or we don't want to have disinformation or
Indeed.
harassment. So we would welcome actually accessibility chat to share their ideas with the people sitting on the internet about how social media, what could be the attributes of more empowering communities.
okay, well, let's put that in the questions for tomorrow's chat.
That's
Excellent.
a great idea.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us on the show.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you
a
for
pleasure.
honoring us, being on here. Thank you for the work you're all doing, making the world a better place. We are very grateful. Very
Thank you.
grateful.
Thank you.